Hello and welcome. Great to be online again for another episode of our Switch for Life series. And today we're going to be looking at optimal stress. So I'm Rochelle Weir, for those that haven't met us yet, and I am joined by the infamous psychologist and behavioural economist and renowned author, Phil Slade.
Well, if I wasn't stressed out, I am now. After that now I'm keeping myself in optimal stress.
Oh, awesome. All right. So we are recording this session today. We are live streaming on YouTube. The team are going to post a link to our YouTube channel as well. So if you have issues with LinkedIn, feel free to switch between the channels. Hopefully that will work for you. The session should go for about 45 minutes. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Let us know what resonates with you or what questions you have throughout the session. And we'll look to try and answer those or address those either in session or after the session. So I think with that, we might jump into it. So what are we going to cover today? So in this session, we're going to look at sort of 4 key areas. So we want to have a look at the difference between good and bad stress. We also want to have a look at stress and performance. We'll unpack some of those personal signs of overwhelm and give you some practical strategies for managing that. So we want to make sure that everybody is in a good space, and we're going to be sharing some links throughout the session to some supporting materials and some extra things that you can do to deepen your understanding. Sounds like a plan?
I think it's a good plan. And as we get to the managing stress bit, I know that sometimes some people are here in the session looking to discover how better to manage their stress. And some people, your managers or your leaders of teams, looking at how you manage the stress levels, optimal stress levels of your teams. Obviously, in 45 minutes, we're going to give some practical insight into that. But we really encourage you, if any of what we talk about in the next 45 minutes inspires you to be thinking a little bit more, just reach out to us, because we'll want to keep the conversation going a little bit. Hopefully you get enough out of it for both of those reasons. But I suppose we've got to start with really defining what stress is. Now, the stress research in the psychological literature, diverges a little bit, but I think this is one of the great definitions that I like to use. So it's a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances, to experience high cognitive load due to a stressor. So for a lot of people, like, thinking about stress and the stressor are separate things. Often people get things quite confused, and we need to pull it apart. What's interesting also about this is it's a state, it's a mental state, which from our perspective differs from an emotional state, and we're going to go into that a little bit more. But I think this is a really good example, and I love this picture of what's the stressor and what's the stress. A stressor is an external thing that's happening, that's causing stress. And the stress response inside of your brain, the cognitive load, the strain, that mental state, is what we call stress. So, what we often call it's a stressful environment. Well, that's the environment. There are things in the environment that are stresses, and to be able to pull apart the environment and then and have stresses and stress, I think it's good language to start to pull apart what is a stress and a stressor. But we do have positive stress and negative stress.
Absolutely.
Right?
Stress gets a bit of a bad rap, and we're going to probably challenge that thought process a little today. And we're going to call them out. They actually have 2 different labels. So eustress is this positive stress that happens in your life. So these are external things that create an internal reaction or a physical and mental, and impacting your physical, mental, and emotional well-being. So this is about, now I've lost my train of thought. So the positive stress response is about involving optimal levels of stimulation. So these are results from things that you find challenging, but yet still attainable. These are enjoyable or worthwhile tasks. So things like a new job, a new relationship, going on a roller coaster ride, winning a race, or finally being able to run a marathon, or, going on a first date. All of those things that create that high level of excitement or positivity, energy, that's all positive stress, and they're all positive stresses that cause eustress. as opposed to distress. So these are the negative responses. So these are impact our physical well-being as well as our mental state. So these are things like demand, like a lot of demand over time, loss, or perceived threats. So financial strain, having a lot of work to do for a long period of time at an unsustainable level, loss of a loved one, or the fear of the loss of loved one, or even a potential job security. All of these things cause distress. So these are stresses that have a negative response on our mental and physical well-being.
And I think part of the problem of the stress getting a bad name has been because of my colleagues and I, the psychological fraternity. I think in the late 80s and early 90s, well, in the 80s, they found this link between stress and poor health outcomes. When we say poor health outcomes, we kind of mean early death, right? And so we kind of got in these whole stress test and scenarios, and I think psychologists really started to go, hey, we've got the big evil. That stress is the big evil. Stress is the giant killer that's going to come and kill everything. And they did all sorts of correlative studies on people in high stress jobs and in lower stress jobs, and the people in high stress jobs lived less long. Like they had less likelihood of a higher likelihood of premature death, right? And so this is weird. We've got to get rid of stress. So then all of a sudden you had beanbags turning up in the and massage things, and then like, how do you just de-stress? And it was de-stressing that was seen as that was going to be the magic pill to help people live longer lives. But obviously that's not very practical, because we can't have low stress jobs all the time, and some people really enjoy those high stress jobs. And so in the 90s they started to do a bit of a study, and instead of just trying to look at people in high stress jobs for the low stress jobs, they added a question when they started to do this, largely survey data, is, do you believe that stress is going to be bad for you? And they found something really interesting. They found that not only do high amounts of stress, does cause negative outcomes, but the perception of stress has a massive impact. So what they found basically was that if you had high levels of stress and your belief about stress being a negative thing was really high, you had a likelihood of early death that was off the chart. However, the same amount of stress, the people in the same amount of stress jobs, if they didn't believe that stress was kind of bad, that likelihood of death basically didn't look any different to a person that was in a low stress job, right? So this idea was that the belief about stress has a hugely mitigating effect on your likelihood of death, negative health outcomes, full stop. Now they were also saying, look, if you are breaking the chain in a stressful environment, you are going to break the chain, right? So there's a relationship though that with stress and the belief about stress. And I think what's really interesting about this is because your belief system, your belief about stress and what stress does to you triggers your emotional side. And it's funny how your emotional reactivity to stress and that emotional state, it can do all sorts of stuff to our physical bodies. And we know this when we look at the science of our emotions. So as a behavioral economist, you would have seen a little bit of these two speeds of thinking and two ways of processing information. We've got our conscious way and we have this reactive way. But that reactive way that's built up over time, automatic behaviors, we've got this machine that's unconscious in our heads that jumps to conclusions. But a large part of that machine is this emotional center, right? And so this emotional center is really driving many of our decisions, perceptions, and the way we see the world and view the world. So when we start to talk about stress, not only do we need to disassociate what is our internal state of stress from the stresses, which are two separate things, but we also need to make a split between our conscious mind and what we can do in our conscious mind to reduce stress and to increase stress if need be, but also how do we manage our emotions at the same time so that our beliefs about stress and our emotional state doesn't overtake your outcomes, really, and start to drive some of those decisions and outcomes. And this is this thing, this emotion versus stress. People think that stress is an emotion, and indeed some researchers sort of still put it in that category. But from our perspective, we don't see that. We see emotion as quite separate from stress. Stress is a conscious thing that you can control the strain over time. It's linked, like they have a relationship. Our brain isn't two separate brains, right? They do link, but you need to control them as separately. And when people, when you blow your top, they go, oh, he's really angry. Oh, he must be stressed. Like that's true, but that stress, it's our emotional reaction to stress. Okay, and we call this our ape, and because it's that ape reactivity is parts of the brain that apes have as well. So we call it our ape brain and our normal brain. That's sort of the language that we've got that wraps around that. But realize that your reactivity, your emotional reaction to stress is a survival mechanism, right? Fight, flight, or comply. Because when you're under stress, what happens is that you're trying to control stuff, and you start to lash out because you're trying to protect it. And what's really interesting is that when we're at work, we're in that high stress situation, we can be very, very good at controlling our emotions. And then we go home and we just want to sit on the couch and watch TV, and the remote falls off the couch somewhere, we can't see it. And then we just fly off the handle. It's just like the smallest thing can just set us off because we've got no more cognitive capacity. The stressful environment being has drained everything, and we're just emotionally emotion is that act of suppressing emotion is highly cognitively demanding in of itself. So suppressing emotion isn't the answer. Just putting it in a box and trying to go, I'm trying not to be angry, is not good, because it's robbing you of the very cognitive energy that you need to focus on the things that you need to do, the stresses that are in environment to reduce that stress. So this is what's really important for us to make sure that we understand this difference between emotion and stress. And the way that we do this is often what we do is to start to look at that emotional side through language. Why do we use language? Language is a conceptual vessel. If we don't have a word for it, we can't think about it. We're going to pull apart this emotion wheel a little bit, because this emotion wheel isn't just words that explain, not just anxious or angry, but the closer you get to the center of this wheel, the higher the activation of the emotion is. So if you're anxious but you're just concerned, it's a low activation, you're in control. And you think about that, you or your ape, As soon as you get close to the center of the circle, it's your emotions that start taking more control, but they're also much more highly active. There's a higher activation. There's a lot more energy that gets put in these emotions, and you can't stay there for too long. So if you're in a work situation where you're kind of panicking a lot, you might have bad bosses or bad, other stresses that are putting you into this overwhelm or panic. If you stay there for too long, this is what leads to burnout, right?
Absolutely. But as not all stresses will create different emotions. They're not singular. So you can have, and some of this is about reframing the way that you see that, as Phil was saying. So you might have, say, for example, you get a promotion. So your emotive response to that potential change to you might be excited. You start with, what, I'm really eager, I might be pumped and excited about this, and then I just become eager as the day as my start day comes along, and then you start, and then you get there, and then you start to see how much work it is and how much you've got to learn, and you're now, starting to get a bit concerned and a bit apprehensive and a bit worried, and you might start to fall into those heightened anxious. So there is being conscious of what you're feeling and what label you've attached to that as well, and how intense that emotion is. This is how you start to manage optimal stress.
Because for a lot of people, they don't even realize that they're in panic. And they just say, oh yeah, I'm really anxious, or how anxious, I don't know. They don't have a word for it. And so being able to put a word that specifically targets how you're actually feeling, and knowing that is a huge step in the right direction. Because when and a lot of people have seen this stress curve, right? The performance on the left, so the higher the line, your optimal performance, and arousal. So how much stress is in the environment. Stress sort of creates this arousal. So if you don't have any stress in the environment, you're just being inactive. When you've got no stress and you're on holidays, you don't do anything, right? And you can go through an entire day. You go, "What'd you do today?" You go, "I don't know, bought coffee and read a book," and it can be really nice, and it helps give you energy back. But when you're at work, you can't be in that space. You'll just never get anything done. So you've got to put stress into the environment, into your own environment, to be able to get things done. What do they say? Ask a busy person to do something, and it probably gets done, because that busy person is already in that state of arousal where they're doing stuff and they're in that optimal state. So that's where we go. That's all the good stress stuff. When the stress is in the environment, the stressors themselves aren't the evil things, right? It's about how much stress or strain those stressors are putting on you, and so that you can sort of dial it up and dial it down. Obviously, when you get too far into too much strain, then for too long, it starts to go into this zone of delusion. This is where we start to get fatigue and exhaustion, which eventually leads to burnout, which is the brain just going, "I've got nothing left. You bashed me up. I need to go." And when people are in burnout, often they need a complete break. Some people it's a short break. Other people can be a long break. But it's your brain's way of being able to get back into control. And often people in that burnout, they go into almost a grief state, because grief is our sort of natural our body's mechanism for dealing with and recovering. It's the body's recovery mode, right? So, and you can see there, what happens with you want to be creative and productive and in flow. You want to be in that optimal stress state. When you're managing a team, you want to be able to get your team in that optimal stressed state as well. It's not just about being friends and having a great time. You've got to put some stress in the environment in order to increase performance. The trick, obviously, is to not make sure it doesn't tick over and people get into overwhelm. So how do you know that? How do you know when you push too hard and either you or someone else is in overwhelm? I think that's a big question, right?
Well, absolutely. And you will feel bad about yourself. You do get that sense of guilt and shame, and I'm not good enough. I'm crap at my job. I'm not smart enough. Whatever negative self-talk you've got going on. But you'll also start to feel physically sick. Have you ever, lost your appetite? You might get the nervous bathroom run. All those, your body will have a physical reaction to overwhelm. It will absolutely let you know that it's not okay. And you also see the signs, because you'll struggle to sleep. So, if your brain just won't shut off and you can't get the rest that you need, which is just a horrible cycle, that just because sleep is so important. So if you get in that cycle, it's just going to make it worse. You'll find you can't concentrate. You're just pushing paper around, or you just procrastinating or not doing quality work. You just that capacity to use your cognitive function to be able to do higher level order thinking isn't there, and you start to get that higher emotive response, as we're talking about that inner circle of the emotion wheel there. If you're starting to get into feeling overwhelmed, you're feeling panicked, you're feeling that sort of extremes level of emotion, these are all really serious signs that you're in that burnout zone, and you should be starting to think about it. So if you can label that emotion to go, you know what, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling panic, or I'm furious at the world, I'm furious at everything, or I'm in despair, any of those kinds of words, if that's how you self-identify, then you're potentially being under stress for too long, and you need to do something about it.
And so this is where we start to look at, okay, we understand what stress is, we understand the difference between stress and stressors, and we're starting to now talk about how do we deal with stress in a productive way, both from the emotional side as well as from the rational side and your more rational thought. And if you're struggling with that split, we'll hopefully get into it and you'll understand that a little bit more by the end of this session. So this is where we start looking at how do we use language to help us navigate and better manage stress from an emotional point of view and your emotional side. This is about this belief about stress and all those sorts of things. So
here in this model, this is not just a model to be able to articulate how active or aroused your emotions are. It's also a model of being able to dial it back. So if you're furious or fuming or even frustrated, it's okay to be angry. You know, there's a lot of times where it's appropriate. Anger is an emotion that we have for a reason, right? But just dial it back to annoyed. So when you get at home and you're looking for that remote that's not there, you can be annoyed. It's okay. It's not that you have to be all happy all the time and peaceful, but just be annoyed at it. Don't let it run into irritated or frustrated or fuming or furious, you know. Or if you find yourself lacking in motivation from an emotional point of view, you might want to dial it up. You might go, okay, I need to find something that's going to excite me. I need to get a bit of energy. I need to somehow get into a higher activated or a higher, more arousal somehow in my motivation. Now, this is where anxiety actually can work really well, because sometimes you need to dial up the anxiety in the system to be able to activate that team's emotions. I know that's how I work. I can be excited about something, but I actually need to be anxious. That's where deadlines and looming deadlines come in. It creates this anxiety. Deadlines work really well for me. They don't really work well for you, right? The number of things on your list tends to work for you, right? But it's the same sort of underlying, you know, both scared and anxious. You could be scared about failing. You could be anxious about these sorts of things. We all have these sorts of fears, and scared and anxious are both sort of fear-based emotions. They're very useful emotions for us to be able to dial up and dial down. So looking at anxiety as not the enemy, I think is number one. But you just don't want to be panicking or overwhelmed. As soon as you get into that higher arousal state, you can't stay there for too long. You know, you're ecstatic. Let's go for happy, for instance. And if you're at a concert or you're hanging out all day for an artist that you're trying to see, and you're in that ecstatic state all day, and then finally the artist comes on stage, and what happens? People faint because they're ecstatic. Their brain goes, I need to recover now, and they miss the concert, right? It's because they can't physically stay in that heightened state of emotion for a long period of time. It doesn't matter what the emotion is, you're too highly aroused. So dialing it up and dialing it down is really important, and know how to dial it up and dial it down is massively important. But this is the start of the understanding and managing emotion, particularly as it relates to stress, and understand that the emotion that's linked to stress isn't the same as the stressful environment that you're dealing with. So there's a bunch of things that we can do at that emotional level, not just with words though. So there are other sort of practical things that we can do, right?
Absolutely. So labeling and being able to be self-aware and being able to call it and be conscious of that is absolutely imperative. But there are other things you can do. So switches or mental things and mindfulness, journaling, deep breathing exercises, all of those things that just consciously switch you out of that ape brain into your cognitive thrive mindset are all really, really important for being mastering that ability to dial down those emotions. But also just having some self-compassion, you know, give yourself a break and the time and space that you need. Acknowledge that, you know what, you have been going hard for a period of time and you need just some downtime. And so don't beat yourself up for needing to binge on Netflix for a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, it's actually self-care and something you might need to do in order to stay in that optimal stress zone, as well as looking after the vessel. I know everybody tells you this and we all know we should do it. But when we are drained, we often fall into bad habits, which actually just make it worse. So eat well, drink water, exercise, get sleep, all of it, you know, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but it is really, really, really important for managing your mental health.
Because when you think about it, emotions are just chemical reactions. Like they're just chemicals that happen in our brain that create the feelings of emotions, right? But it's a chemical electrical mix, right? And our body, our physiology is all about chemicals, right? The food that we put in creates chemicals. You know, if we're drinking sugar and coffee all the time, that's going to be some sort of stimulation. That sort of, because stress, like when you look at the stress curve, stress is a stimulant right? Just like coffee is a stimulant, or sugar is a stimulant, right? And so that's why that's occurred. Like, you have too much coffee, and you start to drop your performance. Like, it can, stimulants help to get into that state of activation, right? So this is why a lot of people like just having a coffee or a tea to keep the day going,
energy
right?
drink
Or an energy drink, right? But too much and you fall off the end. So stress is like your natural coffee, right? It's your natural stimulant in order to make it work, right? But that's that relationship that happens between what we eat and our physiology, our physical world, and how that creates the chemical balance within us to have those emotional reactions. So it's all linked. You can't pull it apart, right? And I often think, I talk about the curves often, when I have a couple of beers and I'm playing pool, and my game gets so much better, my performance goes up. But as soon as I hit about the third beer, it goes down again, right? It's the same sort of thing, I mean, alcohol is a bit more of a suppressant than a stimulant, but you understand the concept of being able to dial things up and be able to use our own physiology, our own stress mechanisms. We've got an inbuilt superpower in order to help us get motivated, right? And I think this is pretty amazing. So that's the emotional side of it. But often when people go, oh, you're a bit stressed, or let's go and do some mindfulness activities, and that can be really good, but it doesn't fix the stresses, right? The stressors are still out there, right? And remember, in that study, like, you could have a low belief about stress being negative, and you go, yeah, no, I can handle stress. I don't think it's going to affect my health, and I've got my emotions in check, and I'm not being that emotionally reactive cycle that keeps getting more stress. But that doesn't actually fix the stresses. And I think that's the other side that we need to talk about, to go, what are some of the practical things you can do in that more rational state to decrease the stress, particularly if you're in a situation where the work's still got to get done. Where people say, I keep getting, my job keeps getting more complex, and I don't get more people to help me and more pay. Like this, that's just life, right? Life gets there. So we've kind of broken this down into 4 areas. And for those of you guys who are already aware of APSI, you'll be able to see APSI in here, but we're not going to go into that. But we're just going to go here, the 4 big areas or focus areas that you can use as a bit of a list to try to pick through and find some strategies that work for you. So these 4 areas are about lifting up, they're about connecting, they're about planning, and then they're about doing, right? And some people get, oh, I'm stressed. Well, what are you doing about it? Well, nothing. I'm thinking about being stressed about it. Well, that's not going to help, right? You've got to do some stuff, right? So this is maybe the inconvenient truth for everyone. It's not just about having a holiday. Is not going to decrease your stress. But lift up. What does that mean? Lifting up means looking at what's the light on the hill? Why did you get into the industry or do the job in the first place? Like, remember that. Be able to get your eyes away from just those short-term things that the end of the day, or the immediate stresses, the burning platforms that are right in front of you, to be able to go, actually, why we're doing this is because of these short-term goals or long-term goals. And what's the benefits? What's the why? What is the why that's sitting in here? If you've got a really strong why, you'd be surprised at how much your brain can handle stressful situations, because it just changes your perspective. It changes the way that your brain views those in a very conscious sort of way, and it has a good relationship to your emotional side, because your emotional side isn't all of a sudden wanting to protect you from these stresses. It's like, oh, these stresses are helping us get to that point, so let's get to that point. But it's not
just helping to reframe that around, so you might be feeling anxious, but being able to look up, look out might reignite your feeling of excitement or your feeling of optimism for the future. So it's still the same environment, but you're reframing your emotive response to that.
Absolutely. And so it's and we often say start there. That's where to start. And once you have that, once you've just lifted your eyes from that immediate environment that just feels overwhelming, one of the things you can do is to connect, right? You've got people around you. Delegate. Don't try and carry the weight of the world on your own shoulders. You want to swarm. So swarm is this idea of bees that swarm to a problem. Put it out there and say, hey, we've got to get this done. I can't do it. I'm drowning. Or we've got this common problem. How do we swarm around this issue and solve this together? So you're not carrying that weight. But also, when you're connecting, you can start to set some boundaries for communication, because sometimes talk, too much talk, and you just more talking, not enough doing, right? So you might be able to say, as you're swarming, you might change the mode of communication. You know, if you're often on the phone to people, just go back to text messages, do something, or say, you know, I'm going to have like 30-second conversations here, you know, whilst I'm doing this. And you set those expectations and those boundaries with other people. It's like, I've got this massive project that's due in 2 weeks. I don't know how we're going to do it. Whilst I'm talking, so this could be your partner or your spouse. Go, as we're talking, I'm going to talk in really short sentences, but it's just because I'm trying to save that cognitive energy that I would otherwise spend on social interactions all this time period to the essentials. So being able to set up some of those things which just give yourself the brain space to be able to deal with it can be really, really helpful. It's not the panacea, of course, but it can be very, very helpful. And once you've been able to set those, being able to connect, lift up, connect, then plan. People underestimate how vital a plan is, particularly if you have got so much to do. You get into doing mode and just do stuff, and the stress seems to never end.
You can't see the forest for the trees.
Can't see the forest for the trees. And if you step back and go, okay, I'm going to spend 5 minutes just making a plan, sketching it out, writing a diary, sort of going, okay, how I know I've lifted up, I know the light on the hill, we've got a team of people who are connecting around it. How are we going to get from A to B in a way that's useful?
It's that sense of control that you get back. So when you start to fall into that overwhelmed state, it's chaos. It's utter chaos, and it's too much going on. I've lost control, and I feel hopeless. So having a plan, being able to go, okay, I'm clear about capacities, on how this is going to work, what the priorities are, what I've got to get done, and sort of you start having a positive. You feel like you're being, you know, proactive instead of reactive to the stresses in your life.
And it can be hard when you're under pressure, because particularly if you're a doer, sometimes being able to step back and just have that moment to plan. Even with your team that's feeling overwhelmed, to be able to say, team, sit down for a second, and they're like, we've got so much to do. What are you making us stop? Say, right, let's just look at the plan. Are we doing the right things? And when you have a plan, all of a sudden you can prioritize a whole lot better, because you'll be able to say, here's the goal, here are the things we're trying to achieve. This thing that's taking me a lot of time, actually not important right now. I need to focus on
work smarter, not harder.
All those sorts of things. But you can't work smarter, not harder, if you don't know what the plan is and where you're going and all those sorts of pieces. So if you're managing a team and you're worried about, oh, they're already so busy already, I don't want to interrupt them, you're going to help them. And I'm not saying to have a 3-hour planning session, but you know, make sure you plan. This enables them to create progress, and often it's good for us as well. And finally, this is Rochelle's favorite. Just do it, all right? You know, this is the whole set boundaries for communication. Yes, you want to connect with people, but sometimes you also need to close the door. Once you've connected, you're not doing it by yourself, and once you've task allocated and things like that, just sit down and get it done. Just
block some time, reschedule some meetings. So you've only got the essential stuff, or whatever you need to do. Create some space and just get priorities done. So because that also gives you a sense of achievement and progress. So you'll feel like, again, you're back in. I had a plan and I've executed the plan. You'll get some positive endorphins come through because you're achieving things and you are getting progress. So which then puts you in a better headspace. So it's a much better way.
And what we often find is that when we've got stuff to do, it doesn't turn up in our diary, and so people put in meetings in our diaries and things like that. When we're talking about planning and using your diary to plan and schedule time, actually put in your diary, this is my time to be able to do this task. So your task becomes something that's time bound. Find that gives you a bit of a deadline as well. I've only got an hour to do this. I should start doing it now. But it also just helps you mean that other meetings aren't going to pop in because they go, oh, you got nothing on. Let's put a meeting in. They go, no, I'm stressed. Like, go away, you know. So yeah, that's it. The list and just doing. And it's amazing how once you get the plan and you start doing, you've got a greater sense of locus of control over what you're doing, then you can start to navigate that task. And so this is when the stresses are task-based stresses, where the stress is about the amount of things that you have to do, or the type of things that you need to do. When stresses are people, And so you've got a bad boss. That's kind of a different thing. And if that's the kind of stress that, or you're in some sort of relationship that is creating a lot of stress, sometimes this sort of thing doesn't necessarily help in that. Go back to that emotional state, but you need to do other things to be able to navigate some of that stress. And we're not going to go into too much of that here, because I think that's where we covered off that in some of our other webinars on sort of psychopaths in the workplace and things like that. But it's important to be able to say, what are my stresses, so that you can go, is this appropriate for either dialing up or dialing down the activation that I need. Yeah, and if you are having those stresses, reach out to us, because there are other things we need to do. It's just slightly more complicated. But I think for most stress, this is a great model. Going, okay, when I'm in a stressful situation, I need to keep my emotions in check. I need to make sure that I don't trade off, that time. I still need to go for the job, look after the vessel. I need to be able to look at that emotional side and that chemical balance side, that balance to my life. And then I need to be able to make sure that I attack the day with an appropriate level of arousal and activation, and create those guardrails: lift up, connect, plan, and do. Lift up, connect, plan, do. Lift up, connect, plan, do. And that's where you'll start getting back in control, and you'll move yourself back from overwhelm to into that optimal stress space. And I think, the point Rochelle raised before about being compassionate to yourself is so important. And I think it's worth just coming back to go. So some people just really beat themselves up and feel really guilty and shameful about what they haven't done, or where they fall short. And just go, you know what, if you're lifting up, connecting, planning, doing, lift up, connect, plan, do, and you've got a good sense of your own emotions, then you'll be content with what you can do and what you have been able to do. And you'll be thinking more clearly about the projects, and will be less about you and be more about the project. So we love this model. We love this model to be able to look at stress.
But we've been talking about, dialing it down and staying out of that zone of delusion and the fatigue and burnout space. But there is also the beginning of that stress curve that we talked about, where there's a lack of stress in the situation in order to get into that green optimal stress zone. So some things that you can think about for yourself or your team, if you're in that space, is about having a shared threat. So creating those stresses, they don't have, it's not about, wishy-washy, let's just put a big date on the wall for the sake of it. They have to be meaningful. So working with your team to identify a project with an aligned goal, or some things that need to be done. You might be able to do some proactive work, or some, it's around creating something that, remembering that eustress is around positive energy and feeling of worth and professional development. All of those kinds of things fall into that space around putting you into an optimal stress zone, because you are learning new things and doing things that are positive for you and your group. But and this is not a linear process, but don't confuse, so that self-compassion that Phil talked about, don't confuse that sense of I'm not motivated with I'm lazy, and perpetuating some of that guilt, shame, language we talked about before. So, maybe you should just enjoy the fact that you're not getting slammed right now, and don't beat yourself up about it. It's okay to not be working at 200% because you just need a downtime, and you're under stressed. So at the moment, enjoy it, because it doesn't happen bloody often in our working lives. So just have a little bit of that self-compassion again. This is the last tip I wanted to share, is a great one, particularly if you're trying to create a new habit, a new healthy habit like running or anything like that, is give yourself an exit clause. So you're not feeling motivated, you don't want to do it, you can't get into it. Well, just say, you know what, I'm just going to do 15 minutes. All I've got to do is 15 minutes, and then I'm good. And if all you can do is 15 minutes and you need to tap out, then all good. Don't beat yourself up about it. But you'll often find the hardest part is getting out the door, is getting started, doing the first thing on the list, writing the first line of a report. It's always that first initial bit that is actually really, really hard, and we overthink or overanalyze or procrastinate on. And once you get into it, you'll probably find that you might stay more than 15 minutes. You'll just smash out whatever it was that you were trying to do. You'll get into flow. So really recommend, just giving yourself permission. I'm just going to do 15 minutes, and if that's all I get done today, and you know what, it's okay, because it's 15 minutes more than you would have done it earlier. So it's all about progress.
It's funny, when we talk to teams, we do a lot of work obviously with teams, and we say to the people within those teams, we'll go, well, remember back to a time when you were in a great team, where you were doing some great work, where you found that meaning line and were doing really good work. Inevitably, 99% of the time, people will tell the story of a team that they were in where they had a common threat, where something was threatening them. It could even be COVID sometimes it was where they had, that's right, and they were understaffed and undermanned, and they were under an incredible amount of stress, but the team banded together and we were able to do something that was amazing. And that's an example of good stress. Like they're self-reporting their memory of these teams being the highlight, right? This is when they were at their best. Right? So they don't say, oh, we were in this team, we didn't really have to do much, and it was great, we sort of came in and just, lazed around a little bit. That's not the stories that they ever tell. They tell these stories of when the chips were down and they had to band together as a group and attack a problem. So if you're in a team that needs motivation, sometimes that motivation needs to be that common threat. How to attack, what is that common threat, and find that. So I think it's an interesting little start of a conversation in terms of teams and threat. But if there's anything that we have talked about that sort of resonates, there is a bunch of resources out there that you can access. So there's the book, the Going Apeshit book, which is all about that emotional reactivity and losing the plot. We have a Switch app that you can download from the App Store or the Android or whatever. It's just called Decide a Switch. If you just go for Switch, it'll give you Nintendo Switch, which is not us. But also there's a survey on the website, and we've just put a link to that in the chat channel there. But it's, if you go to decider.co, there's a survey link there, and you can deep dive a little bit more into your emotional reactivity and the way that your conscious rational brain works. It just takes it down to that next level of detail, and a lot of people find that really interesting. And just keep an eye out for other webinars that we're putting and that we're doing. There's the next webinar that we're doing, I think, is when, Michelle?
Next month. But before I go into that, I just want to wrap up here. So if you take away nothing from this session, we just want to kind of land with these three. Just remember, some stress is good. Not all stress is bad. Learn to identify and label your emotions, and practice different strategies. We've gone through so many different ideas today that help you to stay in that optimal stress zone, or help you to help your team stay in this optimal stress zone.
Yeah, too little stress and you won't get anything done. Not enough stress. And also telling your teams and people around you that stress isn't bad. I think we're starting to break this idea that stress is the giant killer. It's like anything. Too much of anything isn't great, okay? But
the key is moderation.
The key is moderation, right? But also just not pathologizing stress. The belief about stress, don't forget, was a major mediator of basically dying early, right? So I don't think any of us want to die early, right? So we want optimal stress and keep our emotions in check and keep our beliefs in check, and we'll all live longer, happier, more meaningful lives.
And who wouldn't want that? So speaking of our next event, so our next event is how to have difficult conversations on the 11th of August. Same channels will be doing the YouTube and LinkedIn again. If you're interested, I'm just going to put a link to our events, as well as the recordings from some of our previous events, including the one Phil mentioned earlier about working with workplace bullies. So have a look at those. We'd love to know what you think. Also, please give us a shout out on our social media channels. There's some link, or if you'd like to keep the conversation going, drop us a line. We are very passionate about this, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
That's right.
Thank you so much for making time to chat with us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.